My talk today is entitled Forest Understory Overstory Relationships. What do all plants require to grow, or what do all plants need to grow? Here we're talking about the overstory-understory relationship. So overstory trees, say in a pine plantation or naturally generated pine or hardwood stand, and then the understory vegetation, forbs, shrubs, grasses. And within a pine plantation, you could even have understory hardwoods. But all plants require what? Sunlight, some amount of light, nutrients, media, so media to establish roots in, to grow in, so nutrients, and then water, some amount of moisture. And of course, these limited resources, site limited resources, light, moisture, nutrients, often become limited because they're in fact demanded or they're required by both the overstory and the understory. So at some point, eventually, the overstory and the understory will start competing with one another for these limited site resources. So you have, say, within a loblolly pine plantation, you have the intra-specific competition for these limited site resources at some point between a loblolly pine planted seedling or tree and another tree. And then you have that loblolly pine tree competing with, in an interspecific manner, say with other species, with say hardwoods or shrubs, other woody vegetation, non-planted, or forbs and grasses and sedges. Because there's often at some point, there's going to be limited site resources. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the understory-overstory relationship, or the overstory-understory relationship, depending on your perspective. And we see that here. Whereas overstory stand density increases, your understory biomass at some point has to decrease. So you get this general shape, kind of a reverse J shape, I guess you could say. And that's because there are limited site resources. At some point, as the overstory trees become large in size, they start out competing or limiting, you could say, light, particularly light for the herbaceous vegetation, but also nutrients and moisture for the woody vegetation as well. Not planted, let's say, in a loblolly pine plantation. But you start to have this excessive amount of competition, and then of course, some plants start to lose an advantage, and they start to, in a sense, decrease their growth rate because there's a limited amount of site resources. So what can we do then to modify this relationship between the overstory and the understory? Well, one thing we can do is to thin. Here's your overstory stand density. This is actually slash pine plantations. Here's your overstory stand density. Here's your age. And of course, with age in pine plantations, at least up to some point, but certainly within up to age 30, 35 in slash pine plantations, right? With age, stand density increases. And then here's your understory vegetation production. Your herbaceous forbs and grasses, in this case, okay? And then you also have your woody vegetation, your understory woody vegetation. And we can thin the stand. One thing that we can do to modify the overstory, understory, understory, overstory relationship, depending on your perspective, we can thin so that for the understory plants, basically the amount of light, particularly, right, as we start getting up into these stand densities over here, the amount of light still remains relatively high that you can maintain your understory production when you have thinning. And then of course your moisture and your nutrients also remain relatively high, even though you have a higher stand density at some point. But that thinning allows us to manipulate that overstory understory relationship. So what are some other things that we can do to manipulate the understory overstory relationship? Well, we can plant various species, so we can talk about various hardwoods, but here we're just going to talk about certain southern yellow pines, slash, shortleaf, longleaf, and your loblolly, of course, are your major southern yellow pines. And we can plant, say, longleaf as opposed to loblolly. Generally, longleaf has a little different crown structure, particularly when younger, but also even when older, that will allow for a little bit more light to penetrate through the canopy. So even though you have the same overstory stand density, say at breast height, basal area per acre, for the same stand density, you can have a little more light being transmitted through this crown as opposed to loblolly because it has a different structure. And thus more light can reach through to the understory to maintain its production because, of course, the understory is looking forward or needs light and moisture and nutrients to survive. And then also there's different nutrient requirements among the species. And this, we can also, as I said, talk about different hardwoods, different pines. I suppose you could talk about eastern white pine as well in certain parts of the southeast. But here we're talking about southern yellow pine in Mississippi. Longleaf pine generally has lower nutrient requirements relative to slash and loblolly. So you could think of it that if we're going to plant longleaf or say naturally generated longleaf stand as opposed to say loblolly, that the understory vegetation should have through time in general more nutrients available to it because longleaf has lower nutrient requirements than the loblolly pine. So in general, there may be more nutrients available to the understory through time because of the lower nutrient requirements of the longleaf. And then if we throw in the kind of the differences in the light transmission between the canopies, understory vegetation under a longleaf, or I should say understory vegetation under a longleaf canopy, may be greater for the same overstory stand basal area. And here we can definitely see differences in the crown structure at younger ages for sure. This is loblolly on the left and on the right, and then this is of course your longleaf. And definitely at this age, longleaf has a much different crown structure. And you can see how even roughly for the same overstory stand basal area, even when these longleaf are smaller than the loblolly, but once they get up in size to the loblolly here, it'll have a different crown structure. And it'll maintain this difference for a while, probably at least I would think until at least age 10 or so. But even when older, it'll still have a little different crown structure, right? But definitely at this age, more light will be available to the understory vegetation, the herbaceous vegetation, but also the woody vegetation, shrubs, hardwoods, let's say. So you can definitely see there's a difference between the species and how you can manipulate that for your benefit depending on what your management objective is. Say timber production versus wildlife habitat, or the combination of the two, as well as other objectives as well. So another thing that we can do to manipulate the understory-overstory relationship is change the planting density. And so we just talked about the overstory and the understory and how eventually the overstory starts outcompeting the understory. And so we see this kind of this reverse J shape as stand density increases. Well, if we plant lower densities, we should remain over here for a longer period of time. Now, eventually these stands will kind of all catch up to each other, say canopy closure, and that there won't be much difference between the two of them eventually in many ways. But at least for a longer time when younger, you're going to have more light, more moisture, more nutrients available to the understory in a lower planting density than a higher planting density. You can see that here in the 303 versus the 605, that in this area here, you're going to have more light available, like most likely a better ability to have nutrients and moisture taken up by the understory here for a longer period of time, say, than in the 605 stand. And of course, that's also advantageous a lot of times from a timber production perspective. You can have lower seedling costs, lower planting costs. You can plant fewer seedlings. And if you're bedding, ripping, banded herbicide applications, you're going to have, in a sense, less passes over the site, so that should help reduce your site preparation costs. It should help reduce, if you're bedding or ripping, say less compaction, perhaps a little less erosion because you're having fewer passes. And it could be advantageous during the first thinning, these alleys that are created by lower planting densities that may help access to, say, like a foliar buncher during the first thinning. So there are advantages to lowering the planting density, both from a understory perspective as well as an overstory perspective in many ways. And so here you can see that, of course, as your basal area increases, your understory biomass decreases. But if you plant at a lower density, you should be over in this range of stand density, and thus your understory production should be greater for a little longer period of time. And then, of course, here's your higher planting densities and then your lower planting densities. And here's your age through time and then your crown closure. And you would definitely expect that for lower planting densities, the time to crown closure would be less. And, of course, when you get crown closure, you have intense competition for light, also moisture and nutrients, particularly for light between the overstory and the understory. So the longer that you can delay that crown closure, that should be better for the understory. And as I said, eventually they'll all kind of catch up regardless of the planting density. But definitely the lower planting density reaches that canopy closure plateau, I guess you could say, later in time, say here at least 10 or 11, as opposed to the higher that reaches around 5, 6, or 7. And so that gives you a little more time to have that understory production with a little more, I should say, a little more understory production for a little longer time. So what does the lower planting density do to yield, say, saw timber quality or your markets from a timber perspective? Well, often the lower planting densities will have more higher valued markets per acre than the higher planting densities, particularly when you get up into this range. You could talk perhaps a little bit about wood quality, that yeah, you have a lot more, say, saw timber in your lower planting densities, but the wood quality may not be as good. But often the wood quality is not greatly impacted by the lower planting density. Now you get down to, say, like 100 trees per acre, well then it might. But this is definitely, there are advantages to lower planting densities, both from a understory vegetation production as well as a cost perspective in terms of how much it costs to reforest the site. Fewer ceilings, fewer passes if you're bedding, ripping, banding, banded herbicide applications. Should use less chemical, should use less passes, right, etc. So there are advantages to the lower planting densities, and often a good planting density could be, say, 450 to 400, a good trade-off between the overstory and the understory relationship. Another thing we can do is manipulate the configuration, so not just the planting density, but the configuration. And many times we think of rectangularity. And what we can do here is we can modify the rectangularity, so get away from square plantings, more rectangular, and how that can modify the amount of light, moisture, and nutrients to the understory as the canopy, as the overstory trees grow. And so here we can see the planting configuration definitely between rows as opposed to within. This is the extreme. This is actually an agroforestry, but you can definitely, you get the concept of the rectangularity and how that can impact the amount of light, moisture, and nutrients in this region for a longer period of time. The crown closure is less in this time, and how the configuration can modify the understory, overstory relationship. And in many ways, once again, if we're bedding, ripping, we can reduce the cost. The banded herbicides, we can reduce the cost. Configuration, the rectangularity can be beneficial sometimes from a harvesting operations, particularly first thinning, where you have it more in a row to pass that equipment. You have more seedlings within a row and less rows. That helps sometimes with the equipment passing through. Studies that find rectangularities of around 2.1 have had minimal impacts on growth and yield from an overstory, say, timber production, sometimes even 3 to 1, 2 to 5. And once again, we can see this here to where this is a 10 by 10 to scale. This is a 12 by 8, so that's a rectangularity of 1.5, and then this is a 16 by 6 rectangularity of 2.67 roughly. And they're all around 435 seedlings per acre, right? 10 by 10 is 100, 12 by 8 is 96, 16 by 6 is 96. But you can see how the rectangularity will impact the understory production and how that may in some ways help, say, with self-pruning as well in terms of overstory production. Another thing we can do is plant different genetic stock of the same species. So not only do the species have different crown structures that may modify the amount of light coming through to the understory, but we are now, of course, with time, with different varieties, say for loblolly pine particularly, we are finding that there are different amounts of light transmission, light penetration through the canopy for different varieties of loblolly pine. So you can perhaps find a certain variety that allows more light through for the same overstory stand basal area density, say at 4.5 feet. And you can even plant different types of seedlings. So we have this is open pollinated and varietals. And you can see these definitely grow much different. So from a timber production perspective, if that's your main goal, you may want to plant a different type of seedling or a different type of genetic stock than if you have more of a wildlife perspective. So these seedlings here may grow slower, right? That may not necessarily be the best from a timber production perspective, but it might be better from an understory production, right? Crown closure may occur at later ages. There may not be as much competition for a longer period of time between the overstory and the understory because the overstory is growing different. You may have a different crown structure that may allow for more light, more moisture, more nutrients available to the understory for a longer period of time. And then, of course, we can prescribe burn. Prescribed burning is where we intentionally light a fire. And we're doing this to help control vegetation. It helps improve the appearance of the stand, increasing the visibility, stimulating the production of plants in the understory. Improves the access, the recreational opportunities. So if you're into hiking and birding on your property, prescribed burning can be very beneficial. And it can improve the growth rates of the overstory trees. Why? Because you're reducing the competition. Remember, as I said, the competition for the limited site resources between the overstory and the understory. And even say in the overstory, sometimes if you have hardwoods and say in a pine plantation, hardwoods or shrubs that you don't want there, and how fire can kill them, particularly when younger and smaller. And fire in many ways helps with nutrient cycling. It's almost in a sense like a fertilization. It decomposes that material and puts it more in a form more readily available to the overstory for uptake. And so, as I said, we can use fire to control woody vegetation, since shrubs and most hardwoods are generally not adapted to tolerate fire, especially when smaller and younger, and therefore they're killed back with the use of fire. And that then, getting rid of the shrubs and hardwoods often allows for grasses and forbs to thrive in the absence of that woody competition. Many native grasses and forbs are fire adapted, similar, say, to longleaf, fire dependent. They're almost dependent on fire. Without fire, their existence almost doesn't occur on the landscape, so they're often dependent on fire. And fire often will result in new green growth that's excellent forage for many species of wildlife. And it's often that herbaceous layer is often very diverse. So remember, the fire kind of acts as like a fertilization. So often you'll have more nutritious understory vegetation, a different species composition that you want, more natural species composition resulting from that fire. And then also there are many understory plants that serve as hosts for insects, and insects are a primary food for many wildlife species. And often the vegetation resulting from the burn provides necessary or needed structure for many ground nesting birds. And of course, we need to talk about the time of the year, whether it's a cool season burn, warm season burn, dormant season, growing season burn, you could say. And then the severity, whether you want a less intense or more intense fire, how that manipulation of that fire, the type of fire that you use and the timing of it will help you with your objective. And here we can see a prescribed burn, and you may think, wow, that's not good. But look at what comes back. I think generally within a week or two, you'll start having herbaceous vegetation come back. Notice there's not a lot of shrubs or hardwoods in this forest. This is your perfect park-like structure that you want. The herbaceous vegetation is much more often species preferred by wildlife, and these species, this understory vegetation will often be more palatable, more preferred, in a sense more tasteable, more yummy to wildlife. So fire helps to a great extent to manipulate that overstory-understory relationship. And notice also how the fires kept out the hardwood, say, and the shrubs for the overstory trees. And longleaf pine, fire-dependent, highly fire-dependent species or ecosystems. Some people recommend that you can burn longleaf as young as age 3. Now you have to be careful with that. Most people recommend certainly by age 5, I think about a height of 6 feet or more. And in the grass stage, you can burn. But the benefits of prescribed burning, or we should say fire, within the longleaf pine ecosystem, and you can see here, this is perfect for these longleaf pines, helping to maintain their existence on the landscape. Here, of course, you're in a plantation, but this is perfect, keeping out the hardwoods and the shrubs, burning back the dead herbaceous vegetation that then results in more, say, nutritious herbaceous vegetation, because this fire is almost acting like a fertilizer, as I said, returning those nutrients to the site, and then that uptake, the herbaceous vegetation coming back is almost more nutritious than before the fire, keeping it like the access very open from the fire. So very much needed in the longleaf pine ecosystem, the benefits of fire. And then if you have a variety of stands, if you have more of, say, like a forest as opposed to a stand, and then even say state or more government-based agencies or industrial agencies or trusts that have several stands, the manipulation of the stands, kind of the landscape management that we can do to provide the wildlife habitat that we want, the manipulation and use of stands to, in a sense, benefit one another. And even across landowners, say with your neighbors, how you can manage through a variety of practices, right? Thinning different species, prescribed burning, fertilization, herbicide treatments, how you can manipulate you can use those practices along with yourself and your neighbors, or if you have several stands in your forest, how you can use stands to, in a sense, help you in your management. So another thing that we can do to manipulate the understory-overstory relationship is herbicide. We can control the vegetation through prescribed burning in part. We do prescribed burning, but we can also control it through herbicide. So we generally use herbicides for site preparation in some stands, in some situations. We do first and second year herbaceous weed control treatments, particularly in pine plantations, but often sometimes we do in hardwood plantations as well. And even a naturally regenerated pine, for sure, we can do herbaceous weed control treatments. And then we have woody release, say more like at ages 10, 15, or 20 in pine plantations. And we can use different tank mixes, different rates, etc., to promote certain species. So tank mixes, meaning we can use different combinations, say, of site preparation, say, of arsenal, chopper, which are emancipir, along with glyphosate, say Roundup or Accord, and then even triclopyr, garland. We can use those in many ways to modify the species composition that we have under our overstory species within our new plantation. So for instance, often blackberry is resistant to emancipir, arsenal, or chopper, but sweet gum is highly susceptible, so we can use it often to promote the blackberry, which is my understanding a highly desirable understory species by wildlife, and we can remove the sweet gum. And so not only is that in a sense beneficial to the rubus in many ways, but also removes that competition to our overstory trees. And that's just one example, everybody. I'm not going to get deep into the herbicides, but that's just one example of how we can manipulate this understory-overstory relationship using herbicides. So we can use banded herbicide applications instead of broadcast, and how we can come over the top of the seedlings with the herbicide, and how that often may reduce herbicide treatment costs, less chemical, less gas, let's say, through the banded But probably more important from an understory production, say wildlife, we're just kind of killing the vegetation here to give those seedlings that advantage over the other vegetation, but we're keeping between the rows this vegetation. We're keeping the light, moisture, and nutrients. Here we're not killing this vegetation, and thus we have this herbaceous here, but also a little bit of woody probably in there, but we have that space available for the understory, that thus we can maintain that understory for a longer time until you start getting more into canopy closure by doing things such as banded herbicide applications. And then we've already mentioned this, the understory-overstory relationship. We can definitely manipulate this relationship by thinning. And so we can thin back the overstory. As the overstory gets higher, higher, higher with age, we can thin and reduce this overstory, reduce the competition to the understory for the limited site resources, particularly light. And so instead of having this curve here with the understory kind of maintains itself through that thinning. And so here we have this, of course, unthinned and intense competition, very little understory vegetation, right? There's very little light, particularly, but moisture and nutrients available to the understory. But if we open that up, we have a lot of light, a lot of moisture, a lot of nutrients available to the understory. So another thing we can do is fertilize. So remember, these species have requirements, and you start getting intense competition for limited site resources. So we can fertilize, we can add additional amount of nutrients. Nutrients are essential, as I mentioned, to overstory production and understory production. Usually we think of the response by the overstory lasts around 6 to 8 years. So often we fertilize in relation to the timing of a thinning or the final clear cut, meaning if I know I'm probably going to thin around age 21, I may fertilize around age 14, 15, and then it may even be around the time of the first thinning that I'm going to fertilize, such that in a sense I capture that whole period of response. If I fertilize at age 14 and I thin again at 21, well, I get 7 years of that response. So in a sense, I kind of capture that whole response of that fertilization. I kind of pay back myself by capturing that response. You know, I probably wouldn't want to fertilize at 17 and then thin at 19, in a sense, right? You know, I'm not necessarily going to get my full response to the fertilization. And we may fertilize, say, at age 21, expecting a final clear cut, in pine plantations at least, say, at age 27, 28, so I get my full response. And you can think of it as when you fertilize, the understory vegetation in some ways can be viewed as a long-term fertilizer. Often the amount of fertilization, the amount of nutrients is in excess of what the overstory can take up at that particular time. So the understory will take that up, and they'll respond as well. That's great for the overstory because as that understory is, right, it decomposes, or if it's burned, it releases that nutrients back. It's almost like a slow release fertilizer as that understory decomposes or burns. And therefore that provides, in a sense, a long-term fertilizer beyond just, say, the direct fertilization treatment. Often we apply nitrogen, N and P, NPK, and sometimes micronutrients are applied as well, depending on the site and the situation. So to produce a response to fertilization, right, you need light and moisture must be available as well, right? So they need nutrients, they do, trees and understory, but they also need light and moisture. So if you have a lot of nutrients but you don't have light and moisture, well, then nutrients may no longer be the limiting requirement. It could be moisture or light. So often we fertilize following thinning because the light's been substantially increased. So if you have a basal area, overstory basal areas at 4.5 feet above the ground, DBH, your overstory basal area is greater than 130 square feet per acre. You should probably thin to get your maximum response of the overstory trees and definitely for your understory production. This will allow the crown response by the overstory trees. So my understanding is, in a nutshell, everybody, overstory trees respond initially through I believe, like an increase in efficiency of the uses, the limited site resources that tree is picking up. The carbohydrate production is slightly increase in efficiency. I think it's like the rubisco. But then it starts getting more and more crown mass, more foliage, more surface area, more foliage. And that interception of light along with the moisture and nutrients allows that tree to respond with greater growth. So if the crowns don't have a room to respond, you're probably not going to get much response to the fertilization. But that room to respond is also advantageous often to the understory vegetation, more light and moisture for that response. So here in the southeast, we often fertilize, I shouldn't say we often fertilize on a particular site, but we have fertilization treatments. Sometimes on some sites we fertilize at the time of planting. We can fertilize at the time of crown closure, initial crown closure around ages 6 to 8 in loblolly pine plantations at least. That's when nutrient demand is extremely high, right around crown closure, intense competition for limited site resources. And then mid-rotation, and that's often following a thinning because of the reasons I just said. And then you can often pair a fertilization thinning, kind of the combination, with herbicide application. Remember I said that you can manipulate the species composition, the understory species composition, through herbicide applications. So you can time, say, the fertilization and thinning treatment with a herbicide application to, say, remove the hardwood. So that way the overstory pine will respond. You have a better control, more species composition that you want because you can get out the hardwoods, I should say, with the herbicide. So there's many different things that you can do to get the desired forest that you want for your management objective. And so here we can see an excessively high stand density stand. This is probably a greater than 130 square feet per acre. And if you fertilize in this stand, how much response are you going to get? Well, definitely in the understory, you're not going to get hardly any response because why? There's hardly any understory to begin with. And even the overstory, you're not going to get much response, right? Because the trees, there's not much room for this tree or this tree or this tree to grow because there's such intense competition. There's not a lot of light. There's probably not a lot of moisture available to them. There's not much room for the crowns to expand. So this is a better situation to fertilize, both for the overstory. It has room to expand the crown, to respond to the additional nutrient requirements, that fertilization, and you get the potential for much more response in the understory vegetation, much more light, moisture, and nutrients available to the understory in these thin stands as opposed to unthinned, high density, unthinned. So fertilization is often here. And as I said, you can even pair it with a herbicide application to control species compositions as well. And that's what I say, how much understory response you're going to get here versus here in relation to a fertilization treatment. And this is something that I put together based on what I've done in the past in timber decision support systems in relation to lease rates. So we can assume that, let's say you're a landowner and you may be an absentee landowner and you're going to have a hunting lease on your land. And these costs are based on cost trends of Southern Forest practices in 2018. And we can assume that per acre, we're going to charge a hunting lease rate, and you can even do this for grazing lease if you wanted to do that, like in longleaf. Well, let's talk to, we can say hunting leases, let's say $7 an acre or $10 an acre. Now, you have different interest rates through time, whatever that may be. And then annually, you're receiving $7 per acre, or annually, you're receiving $10 per acre. Well, what's those discounted back to your zero values of those annual returns? So let's say at 5% annually, 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's say at age 22, at a 5%, if you charge $7 per acre, well, that's roughly, you could expect around a $92 discounted back to your zero. If you were charging $10 per acre, it'd be around $132. So the way that I can kind of view this is when I'm charging these hunting leases, in a way, I can view that I'm going to get my fertilization treatment free. Maybe my fertilization treatment at age 6 or 8 in a pine plantation, or after a thinning, say at age 15, my first thinning here, right? In a sense, I'm almost going to get it, depending on the lease rate and the interest rate, I can almost get my fertilization treatment paid for. And then that way I can think of it as if my fertilization is almost free money coming out of that from the response of the overstory trees, all right? Or a herbicide application or a prescribed burning treatment. So just some way to think about lease rates. And in my opinion, if you fertilize and thin, but let's say you fertilize, but most likely with a thinning, particularly mid-rotation, and even if you apply a herbicide, to me, I think you could charge a higher lease rate. You could argue that I'm providing more vegetation, healthier vegetation through the fertilization that should be more palatable to animals, and then particularly if I use the herbicide to manipulate the species composition that would be beneficial, most beneficial, you could generally think for a wildlife species, I could charge a higher lease rate. Thank you.